Whether the Prime Minister and the President get on doesn't matter as much as we would like to think it does. What we do know is that no matter who wins that election, Canada is in for a rough ride. Things are changing. Tonight we ask the question, does it matter to Canada who that person is?
Hello, I'm Stuart McNish, and you're listening to Conversations Live. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series addressing the big issues of our time. For each episode, we bring together subject matter experts for a deep conversation designed to provide you with information that helps you make more informed decisions. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Conversations Live, Canada-U.S. relations and the presidential election. Tonight, we're peering across the border at the pending presidential election and its potential effect on Canada and our relationship with the United States. We come to you from Kamkamale, the place of many maple trees. These are the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, who have lived on and continue to call these lands home. Osiam. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series that seeks to advance our understanding of the big issues of our times. But we also strive to draw attention to organizations that make a difference in our community and our province. Tonight, I want to introduce you to Harold Munro. He happens to be the editor-in-chief of the Vancouver Sun, but he's also the campaigner-in-chief for Raise a Reader. Raise a Reader is a program that empowers children and families with tools to empower reading skills. These are the skills that are the foundation for lifelong learning that significantly affects quality of life, health, and social and economic well-being of individuals, families, and communities. I encourage you to check out Raise a Reader. You can see their QR code here on the screen at the Vancouver Sun, and support this valuable program where you can. So we're coming to you live from KPMG's Ignition Vancouver venue in person and netcasting live on the Vancouver Sun and Calgary Herald. So in 7 days from now, the polls in the United States will close. And what's interesting is, as we just experienced here in British Columbia, because the polls are so close, it could be days, if not more, before the world will actually know who the next occupant of the Oval Office will be. Tonight, we ask the question, does it matter to Canada who that person is? We like to think so. However, there is some evidence that suggests the dynamic between the two countries is so incredibly complex. Whether the Prime Minister and the President get on doesn't matter as much as we would like to think it does. What we do know is that no matter who wins that election, Canada is in for a rough ride. Things are changing. So we have an exceptional panel tonight with us to discuss the manner in which Canada will be affected by the outcome of the presidential election. Trade and tariffs, environmental agreements, defense, security, economic security, transnational crime, and of course, cross-border trade. The Canada and the U.S. trading relationship is one of the world's most comprehensive. As of 12 months ago, Canada enjoyed a nice trade surplus, wrapping up 2022 of $53.5 billion. Every day, nearly $3.6 billion of goods and services cross the border, supporting millions of jobs in both countries. There's a lot at stake in every sector of the Canadian economy. Our panel tonight brings together representatives from BC, Alberta, and Ottawa. To my immediate right is Calvin Chrustie, a security expert with Critical Risk Team. Maria Rajanayagam of RBC and representing the American Chamber of Commerce. Richard Mahoney of McMillan Vantage joins us from Ottawa virtually. Mario Canseco here on the panel of Research Co. is in person. Gary Marr of the Canada West Foundation also joins us virtually, but he's coming to us from Calgary. And Stuart Prest of UBC is on my far right. Now, this is my business part where I have to thank people who make sure that we can bring these events to you in person and live online, because without them, we can't do that. And I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to name them all. because I really appreciate them. You'll see their logos on the screen throughout the evening. They'll scroll across the bottom of the screen. So, as I say, I can't thank them enough. Our hosting sponsors are KPMG, RBC, and McMillan LLP. Our annual sponsors are BD Developments, Stem Cell Technologies, Rennie & Co., LNG Canada, Landlord BC, Pacific Salmon Foundation, TC Energy, Fortis BC, Polygon, Digital Supercluster, Helijet, and TELUS. Thank you all. And our supporters are BCIT, OPI, and West Coast Reduction. We also work in association with Apogee Public Relations and Research Co. As I say, without their generous support, this program just would not be possible. So one last little bit of business before we dive in, and that is for anybody wishing to submit a question, whether you're here in person or online, please go to slido.com. You can enter the passcode Conversations Live, and Sean, our Slido master here, who's also up at the front, will be receiving those questions. He'll then share them with the panelists and with me, and they'll inform much of or some of what our conversation is going to be about. So, Richard, you're to my absolute far right on the screen here, and you're on the far side of the country. You're in Ottawa. I'd like to start with you because you were just in Washington, D.C., taking the temperature on this very topic. What's your read?
I guess the first read, Stuart, first of all, great to be here, and thanks for having me. I guess the first thing I would say, and to be honest, it's a bit of a surprise, is you kind of forecast it in your introduction there. We're in for some pretty choppy waters no matter who wins this election. I think it's easy for us to say, oh my goodness, if Trump wins, we're really in for it because of the nature of what he did last time and his threats on tariffs and so forth. But my read of it is that no matter who wins, the next U.S. president, I'm not saying there's no difference between the two, and we'll get into that, but we're in for, as you said, a pretty rough ride. First of all, the Canada, U.S., Mexico trade agreement, what we call CUSMA, what everybody else calls USMCA, what the trade consultants and lawyers call USMACA, has an automatic 6-year review period. Many will remember that when Donald Trump was elected president last time, he promised to tear up NAFTA. He used the review process to do that. What ended up happening, interestingly, was, I would argue, an improvement on the original NAFTA. We essentially ended up getting a form of a minimum wage in the auto sector, which probably protected jobs in both Canada and the U.S. But this time, I think, President Trump has made many promises on this, but I think even if Vice President Harris wins, we're looking at a U.S. president who's going to look to renegotiate USMCA, and they're going to do so not from the philosophical kind of reciprocity, I would lower my tariffs, I get access to your market, you lower your tariffs, and get access to my market, that kind of thing. We're looking at very single-minded administration looking to change things. And we need access to their market, frankly. They need access to our market, but we need access to their market even more, given the relative size of the country. So what I heard from the trade lawyers, trade consultants, trade officials on both sides, the Canadian government side and the U.S. government side, is people are getting ready for a pretty tough battle, number one. Number two, and we can come back to this, part of the challenge is going to be officials on both sides of the border and trade experts on both sides of the border are targeting Mexico, and in particular, China's anticipated and already existing incursions into Mexico as a way to gain access to the North American market. So we're in for some pretty big changes. There's some pretty big threats to our most important trading relationship. And while they may be more pronounced under Donald Trump, Stuart, I don't think they're going to be easy under President Harris either.
I think you're right, Richard. When you take a look at the fact that the United States has tightened up on foreign direct investment into the U.S., they're not allowing China to come right into the country. And of course, they've targeted Mexico. But Mario, I'm going to go to you because you are originally from Mexico. And of course, you're here with a Canadian perspective as well. But the new president there, Claudia Sheinbaum, she has basically said, this is Mexico's moment, and we're not going to squander it. So how important do we have to consider what role Mexico will play in affecting our relationship with the United States, because they just surpassed us as becoming the number one trading partner with the U.S.?
Well, it's definitely crucial because of the Chinese influence. And we look into international elections that happened this year, the Labour Party winning in the UK, France getting a shock with the far right rising. That didn't happen in Mexico. It was an election like the ones we used to have 50 or 60 years ago, where the party in power is going to win again. And I think that also sets a very different challenge when it comes to talking to somebody who was elected with such a massive landslide. When you compare it to somebody who's going to come in the U.S. with the vote of roughly 48% of the people. And whatever happens in Canada, if there's an election before we head to that moment. I think part of the complexity here is to look into things beyond the way in which NAFTA was first established. That was a government that was very pro-business, that was interested in making Mexico feel part of the first world, if we were to use the terms that we used in the early 1990s. And of course, the same day that NAFTA comes into place, there's the uprising in Chiapas. So it was a reminder that Mexico wasn't quite ready to join the first world. But it's a very complicated issue because it's a government that is highly backed by the voters, and that has essentially said we're going to keep doing whatever we were doing before. So there is no big difference between the current president and the previous president. And that obviously means that the negotiations are going to be significantly more complicated than they were in the late 1990s, when Carlos Salinas was essentially saying, we'll do your bidding because we want to be part of this.
It's going to be a very interesting time. From your perspective, Gary, in Calgary, and from the perspective of the Canada West Foundation, what do you see as the major issue that we need to be paying attention to when we look to the outcome of the presidential election in the U.S.?
Well, it's challenging for sure, much more challenging than the time that I was living and working at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. I would say that the things to look for are, first of all, look at the exports from Western Canada that go into the United States. By dollar value, the largest province that sends exports to the U.S. is the province of Ontario. But if you look at the percentage basis of your GDP that focuses on exports to the United States, it's New Brunswick, it's Alberta, it's Saskatchewan. So this is really important for Western Canada to understand this relationship, that we are much more trade dependent. The GDP of Canada overall is about 2/3 of it relies upon trade. And in the case of the United States, about 75% of our exports go to one place in the United States. When it comes to energy, I think we really need to change the language that Canadians use. We often talk about how we're the number one energy exporter to the United States, which is true. But to change the language, if you listen to J.D. Vance, he talks about how his home state, Ohio, is the 7th largest producer of oil in the United States. And he doesn't want to hear that foreign oil, oil from Canada, is going to displace the development of oil within the state of Ohio. However, if we were to go out and change our language and say, we export jobs in a pipeline. Now, I've been to the refinery in Lima, Ohio. I've been to the refinery in, I'm here in Detroit. I've been to those don't operate without the energy that comes from Alberta. And so we can legitimately say, if you want job creation in the United States, we export those jobs in a pipeline. That's true for LNG as well. So we ship natural gas into the United States. It's liquefied there, and in some cases, it's exported to foreign markets. So they actually take our raw material and upgrade it and get the additional value of its upgrading. I'd say thank goodness for projects like LNG Canada. The Bank of Canada indicated that when LNG Canada came on stream earlier this year, it raised the GDP of Canada in Q2 by 0.25%. Now, 0.25% doesn't sound like a lot until you realize it's part of a $3 trillion GDP. So this is material. So the idea that we need to move, I was referring to Trans Mountain expansion. But when LNG Canada comes on stream, when it's completed, it will also have a material impact on our gross domestic product in Canada. We need more of those kinds of projects, not less. And I think that in the United States, we have a good story to tell about how energy security, which is important to the United States, keeping the price of a gallon of gasoline under $3 a gallon is really important to presidential elections. We can help do that. And the other piece to recognize is that there are some out of the 50 states of the United States, about 35 of them recognize that Canada is their number one export destination. And so, for example, there is an ACES caucus, an American-Canadian Economic Caucus. The United States House of Representatives and the Senate are divided up into all kinds of caucuses. And this one is a bipartisan one started by a congressman in Nevada who's a Democrat and a Republican congresswoman in the state of Texas. And they've now got quite a number of members who all recognize the importance of the economic relationship and the bilateral trade, what you referred to, Stewart, as the $2 billion a day that goes back and forth across the border. So not all is lost, but we got some work to do. And we've got some friends in the United States that I've talked to that would be willing to help us. So again, I don't think all is lost, but it's going to be tough regardless of whether it's President Trump or President Harris.
So, Maria, does that mean that when we take a look at where our focus should we be aware of who's going to wind up winning the election? But does it start to become much more of those relationships that Gary alluded to, business to business, one business at a time, one state, one province at a time? Because you represent the American Chamber here in Canada. How important are those that we focus on those relationships rather than worrying about what the global or larger picture might be?
Yeah, thanks, Stu. Thanks for having me. Yes, that is important to always maintain those relationships state by state. However, as we saw during President Trump's time, when he increased the tariffs on aluminum and steel, that had a broad-based effect on Canada. And so it goes beyond those 34 states that we have a very strong relationship with. And, getting back to why our relationship with the states is so important, you said we do $3 billion a day crossing that border. 75% of our exports go to the U.S. We are integrated within their supply chain. So what happens in the United States really does affect our economy, our jobs. And I know we talk a lot about the CUSMA or the USMCA, but when you compare and contrast the Biden administration and the Trump administration, there are a couple points that actually really assisted the business community on both sides of the border. So, for example, when Trump first took office, he implemented what's called the Jobs Act, and that specifically focused on foreign direct investment. And so Canada had to respond and up its game. And we implemented an accelerated investment initiative, which expires in 2028, which allows for companies to write down equipment purchases. So it's a tax benefit for us. When Biden came into office, he then put in the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. Again, the Canadian government responded by $80 billion in tax subsidies. So on both sides of the border, whenever the U.S. has changed things outside of CUSMA or USMCA, the Canadian government has responded, and it's helped both of the business communities on both sides of the border, which I think is meaningful to what we're trying to do here. I will note something, however, that doesn't get talked about a lot, which is going to become, I think, an issue, is the digital service tax. You may or may not have heard of it. It's a 3% tax based on large online companies, both foreign and United States. And that was implemented by Canada just this year. And it's something that also many European countries have also adopted. But what does that really do? What that means is companies who are either selling or advertising on these platforms now have to pay an additional 3% tax. So either their margins are compressed or they're going to pass that along to the customer, which means their products or services are going to cost more. And I know this is seen as somewhat as a offensive way to deal with the United States, and it's going to come up certainly during the renegotiation of the USMCA and CUSMA. So I wanted to bring those points up.
Well, I'm under the understanding that the U.S. was not happy with our timing. They were asking us to hold off on that, and that then does impact relations. Stewart, from your perspective, when we watch what's happening at the political level, because it is very divisive, and of course it speaks to our concepts of democracy, how important is it from a political perspective, looking at democratic structures and institutions, that we really do pay attention to who wins the White House?
Well, I think it's a huge factor in how this election is going to play out. When we talk about rough waters on the horizon, I think some of that is going to be the way in which the U.S. government responds to Canada, no matter who wins. But the actual process of the election itself could be a very rough ride. We have seen what happened in the final days of the first Trump administration and culminating in the events of January 6th. We have seen since then the ongoing debate about effectively each side within the United States looking at the other as in some ways less than fully legitimate in the political debate. This is polarization effectively. So it's a highly polarized dynamic, and there are cross-cutting currents. We are also seeing and learning that American democracy is more rugged, more resilient than perhaps we thought at some of the darker days of the last decade or so. But there are still challenges there, and so I think we have to be cautious in watching how this election plays out, because it will have implications for the practice of democracy in the United States and in the transfer of power and so on. And then one of the things that I think really is a distinction between the two candidates when they look at the world, effectively, Canada is pretty comfortable with the way in which Democrats approach institution building internationally. This idea of trying to work towards a rule-governed order. And during the first Trump administration, we saw a much more transactional approach to global politics. And so I think this is going to be one of the distinctions that we have to be aware of. In some cases, Canada can come to a working agreement, I think, with a Trump administration, but it is on that item-by-item, moment-by-moment discussion. And there is an unpredictability there that I don't think we want to discount.
Do you think that it will have a direct impact here in the way that we perceive our own political processes, depending on how it unfolds there?
I have to think so. I spend part of my weekend on social media and interviews in the media, essentially explaining to people that the BC election was a free and fair election, that there weren't ballots being hidden or added to piles and so on, that it was not a misconducted election for various reasons by Elections BC, that Elections BC is actually very good at its job, and we should have full confidence in our elections. But there was that sense that people are ready to disbelieve institutions. And I think we have to be honest that this is, to some extent, an implication of the way in which the Trump administration played out and ended. There's a sense that those who are disaffected with the way in which things are playing out, there's a mistrust of institutions. And I think that is going to be part of our political discussions here in Canada going forward as well.
So I want to introduce another concept in Canada-U.S. relations, and I think that it is one of growing importance. Number one, what is our commitment to military spending, defense, and in particular, I'm going to say the poor job that we're doing in the Arctic, which is of significant concern to the United States. But along those same lines there's security, economic security, cybersecurity, transnational crime. Calvin, from your perspective, how important is this in the nature in which the relationship with the United States continues to change?
Thank you. First of all, I would just I was processing some of the comments, particularly Richard's, which I share is somewhat surprised pleasantly in terms of the introductory comments, and then Richard's comments and the rest in terms of the congruent concerns in terms of which person gets elected and the differential impact. I don't think it's going to be a huge impact. I just think it's going to be the negative consequences to Canada. One's going to be indifferent, and the other one's going to be a little more boisterous in terms of their response to Canada and the outcome. And as it relates to the national security approach, I think those same themes are going to happen when it looks like, whether it be the Arctic security, whether it be the transnational organized crime, the electoral issues in Canada, the political integrity of Canada. I think the U.S., with post the election, I think the one thing that we're going to see shift majorly is going to be less tolerance in terms of Canada as a partner and some of the shortcomings they've had, whether it be in defense, whether it be in national security, whether it be also, and I know we try to put things in boxes, but I don't think we can. I think we should leave that for bureaucracies and policy people. But when you look at the national security issues, I don't think you can untangle them from the economic security issues. And I think Canadians haven't figured that one out. And I think the people that I think are going to be on for a tough ride are those that have artificially created, here's the business issues, here's the economic issues, here's the defense issues, and here's the security issues, thinking that they're two different things. And I think they're very intertwined. And I think Canada as a country hasn't evolved or matured in terms of being able to process that and understand that complexity. And I think post this election, knowing the way the world's going in terms of global polarization, I think you're going to see both leaders shift gears and going, from being a dominant power in the world to going recognizing that there's a bit of a fear, concern, and getting into survival mode. And I think when people get into survival mode, I think the consequences and that are not going to be as diplomatic as we have seen in the past.
So, Richard, I want to come back to you because there is this belief that in Canada that we don't have a sense of urgency around the need to start to address some of these issues that we've already started to bring up. How important is it that we start to be talking about this and recognizing that we as Canadians may not have that special relationship that we always thought that we had, and that we need to step up our game?
I think that's right. And what Calvin said is all, I think, resonates with me too, Stuart. So, I think we've gotten a bit of a free ride on this, living just north of the U.S., the special relationship. Not just Canadian governments and Canadian politicians, but most of us, let's be honest about this, just didn't worry that much about our national defense. And I see a couple things happening. I see what you're talking about, Stuart, which is got a bit of a changing world here. And I think there is a growing realization that we're going to have to make a greater contribution, first of all. Secondly, your point, Stuart, about the obvious thing here, and probably the easiest thing I think to convince Canadians is important, is the point Stuart made, which is that you made, Stuart, which is the Arctic. I mean, if there is one place where we are vulnerable and one place where perhaps, it might be hard for me to convince, if I was still in politics and I was trying to convince a Canadian that we should spend money to defend European countries, they might look at me a little askance. If I start talking about our own borders, I think that conversation now starts to get pretty real for people. And then I guess the other thing I would add is, while the U.S. has always wanted us to spend more on defense, they've kind of benignly let us get away with maybe not making our full contribution to NATO and so on and so forth. That is less the case now. We've had several recent instances over the last couple of years where the Canadian government, in going down to the United States in order to ask the U.S. government to do something or not do something, is facing direct pressure to make a greater contribution. And so that's just realpolitik. That's just happening. And I think whether, this administration, the next administration, they're all going to face that. As I say, the perhaps the best way to do that, other than dealing with a NATO commitment, is to put our resources and our focus on NORAD and the Arctic, where, frankly, both Canada and the U.S. military would tell you we need to beef up what we have there, because essentially our facilities and materials there are dated and out of date, and the threats to us there are more pronounced. There are, you've heard the media accounts about Russian and Chinese submarines underneath the Arctic ice right now. So I think that's a change. It probably is one that, if we do that right over the course of the next decade, can help, as Stewart, as you suggested, can help actually deal with some of the rough spots in the U.S. relationship, but perhaps more importantly, even make sure we can defend our own country.
Yeah. Maria, I see that you want to jump in, and then we're going to go to question number 2 there. And Mario, maybe Maria, then Mario, and then Maria.
Thanks, Stu. I just want to toggle off the security aspect, because I think we've seen security and economics are now intertwined. And I think Huawei is a prime example of that situation. And, it's interesting that for the first time with NAFTA, CUSMA, that we have this review period, because when Trump initiated the tax tariffs on China, the Biden administration did not remove them. And so China found its workaround by going to Mexico. So thankfully, we have this review period to kind of take a look, because before it was literally Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, and now it's diluted, shall we say. Thank you.
Mario.
Not to pile on Mexico, but we were talking about how the election will unfold. The fact that we might have 7 or 8 days before we know who the winner of the election is. And it reminded me of the first meeting of President Kennedy with President Lopez Mateos in 1962. And President Kennedy is explaining the technological advances that allow for the election to be called on election night. And he's talking to President Lopez Mateos about this. And, I knew that I was going to win that election that night. And President Lopez Mateos said, "Oh, Mr. President, in Mexico, we know who's going to win the election 6 months before it happens."
Sean, question number 2, please. Well, you bumped it up to question number 1 now.
Mm-hmm. All right. Canada needs to diversify its economic relationships instead of being so dependent on an increasingly unstable neighbor. How can Canada best do this?
This is an interesting question. Gary, can I go to you?
Sure. I mean, I want to remind people of the Nixon tariffs that were 10% back in the early 1970s. I see Richard nodding his head on this. And, we talked about diversifying our economy back then and expanding our trade partners. Well, one of the ones that, we've expanded to is China. We've tried to expand to India. We haven't done very well in our relationships with either of those two very, very large markets. In the province of British Columbia, they've got a diversification strategy. They're looking at Vietnam and Mexico as I think Taiwan as 3 areas that they want to expand to. But ultimately, it is very difficult to, expand our markets elsewhere when we are right next door to a very, very large marketplace. And that large marketplace has made us as Canadians lazy. I would talk to people who were beef producers, and they'd say, why are you telling me about this marketplace in Indonesia? And I said, well, it's only 350 million people that are looking for halal beef. And their reply would be, well, I can send it to Kansas City. I can speak the language. It's 2 time zones away. If there's a problem, I can pick up the phone. I know how to write a contract. I know how to get it there. And if there's a big problem, I can actually fly to Kansas City and be there later today. But if you're telling me about going to Indonesia, I don't know what the language is. I don't know how to write a contract. I don't know how to get it there. I don't even know what halal beef is. And I'd say, well, okay, so you're not as smart as Australians. And they're a little offended by that. But the reality is that Australia has, done a pretty good job of expanding their marketplaces because they don't have, a relationship with the largest consumer market in the world. And so it's easy to say, it's not easy to do this expansion. We look at, the relationship that we had with Britain and trying to get a free trade agreement with Britain. They pulled out. And the reason they pulled out is because of the issues surrounding supply management on dairy. And the Brits said, you know what, it's not worth it for what you want to do. So we've got to be able to expand our markets while at the same time surviving our relationship with our big partner in the United States.
And so that becomes a very tricky relationship. I know that we have an Indo-Pacific strategy that's underway. We've appointed, very capable people to start to head up that, to build out those strategies. But Calvin, I can see you sort of like squirming around in your chair going, okay, it comes with risks as well. From your perspective, when you hear this, what are your concerns and what is the impact then on our relationship with the United States?
Well, I say in terms of the instability comment, re the U.S., my first instinct in terms of response is, and I come from a practice of being a negotiator, and in negotiation, the number one thing you do before you negotiate is do some self-reflection. And I think from myself, in terms of a security perspective, I don't know if Canada is that much better in terms of stability. We may be more polite, more subtle than our neighbors to the south. But I think we have some significant issues in terms of stability, particularly in the economics space. Maybe not so much in the political space, but definitely in the economic space, in the national security space. So I get nervous when I hear comments about, looking at divesting or diversifying from the U.S., because I do look at, I think there's a huge gap in the Canadians' understanding in terms of the value that the U.S. brings to our democracy, in terms of its national security approach to Canada. It's like the big brother in the schoolyard. And I've worked, with the Americans intimately, and Canada would not be as safe and as stable if it wasn't for the Americans. And I don't think we've done a good job in terms of at the political level, at the diplomatic level, and at the educational level in terms of educating Canadians how much work they do and what they do to protect us. Because I can say, being a former federal police officer, we don't have the ability to protect Canadians from foreign threats, but the Americans were probably the leaders in terms of protecting Canadians. So I don't think we should be too close to going, hey, what's the noisy thing on Twitter? And making an assessment in terms of who our partners are going to be based on X or Twitter.
Stewart, I see you leaning in there. You've got a comment.
Yeah, I think the arrangement for many years has been Canada has been tolerated, just as a number of folks have already noted, to slide along a little bit and not get anywhere close to 2%, say, of its GDP for military spending. But I think the bargain is always dependent on Canada showing that it can defend itself and pull its weight to a certain extent, because the United States is not going, no matter who is president, is not going to say we're going to allow Canada to take care of the North, and if they're not really up to it, then I guess we're not. No one's taking care of the North. The North will be cared for militarily, and on those kinds of issues, Canada really needs to be more proactive. And I think this sense of regionalization around the world implies that no matter what happens in the United States, we're still the Americans' northern neighbor. We're always going to be America's hat. It doesn't matter what else happens, and so we need to build that relationship up and find ways to take part in these the military intelligence conversations. There is, I think, a sense not just in the United States but elsewhere, allies in the Pacific theater as well, and so on, that Canada doesn't take these kinds of issues seriously. That it is willing to coast along a little bit and to be extremely passive and reactive, and that's not going to stand us in good stead, no matter who is president.
So I want to introduce the idea of the environment, and Mike Manier, who's with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, recorded a comment from us about salmon, because they're going to care about who wins the election as well, but it's a way of introducing or bringing in to this discussion the environment. Arav, can you please roll that clip from Mike?
86% of British Columbians regularly rank Pacific salmon as their top environmental concern. So elections have consequences for salmon, and they do in British Columbia and Canada, and they also do in US and will impact our work here in Canada. There are a number of treaties and bilateral agreements that are specifically related to salmon. Those are generally above the political fray, but I think who's in the White House is important in terms of the vision that they set for how important species like salmon are. And do we want a government in the United States that's investing in improving habitat and conserving habitat, improving water, conserving water, in managing fisheries in a sustainable way for the fish as the priority first? And this election and federal agencies in the United States have an impact on that, both in the United States and in Canada. So we're watching this election very closely and hoping for an administration that is committed to environmental sustainability, wild salmon preservation, and conservation.
Muriel, from your perspective, is it going to matter as far as the environment is concerned who does win the presidential election? Because Kamala Harris has said that she would not re-sign USMCA the way that it is. She wouldn't even have signed that NAFTA because she doesn't believe that there's enough environmental protections in the way or in place.
Mm-hmm. I think people forget, partly because how blinded many Canadians are by the prospect of Donald Trump winning the election, that the Democrats are very protectionist. And I'm not talking about salmon. I'm talking about their jobs. I'm talking about their unions. It's not going to be an easy ride in that sense. But there are certain statements that have been made during the campaign that suggest that Kamala Harris is going to be more of an environmentally friendly president. Now, we could go back to 1988. It's the relationship between people that makes things happen. If Michael Dukakis had won, who knows, maybe no NAFTA. It would have been completely different in that relationship with whatever was happening here. And I think part of the complexity that we're going to be facing is how do we bring this together, especially if we are in a situation where the Democrats win the White House and 6 months or a year from now, the Conservatives are in charge in Ottawa. How are we going to make sure that they can talk to each other in a way that makes sense, particularly on the environmental front, because they seem to be poles apart. The only 4 words that consistently come out of Pierre Poilievre's mouth are common sense and carbon tax. And that makes it very complicated when you try to negotiate with somebody who's now the president of the United States.
Richard, weren't you just hosting an event in Ottawa today? What happens if there's a Poilievre government?
Yes, we did. Yeah, our firm hosted preparing for potential Poilievre government. That's right.
And
well, specifically, I mean, I think I'll just pick up on what Mario said there. I think he's on to something. Poilievre, I think one of the things that came out of our discussions today was that I think people are wrong to assume that Pierre Poilievre is a leader like the conservative leaders we've seen before in this country, like Prime Minister Harper, Prime Minister Mulroney, and so forth. He is cut from a bit of a different cloth, much more populist, much more sending the message to organizations, corporations, and people saying, if you want me to listen to you, if you want to make changes or stop changes, then go out there and convince the public that that's a good idea and bring the evidence of that to me. It could, and the public could be stakeholders, could be your workers, could be, it depends on the situation and the issue. So on Canada, US, yes, it's true that if you look at Poilievre and what he believes and who he is, and President Harris, there may be a bit of a gap there. But I'm a partisan myself, but I think the important point is, one, no matter who wins there and here, we do face a similar set of issues. It's true that one leader might be a little better dealing with the threats down there than the other. But, Poilievre is many, many things, but he is a politician in a time of angry populism. And that movement of angry populism is not unique to Canada. It is around the world. Incumbents are losing all over the place, particularly those that have been in office for a long time. And he will face the same pressures and the same issues, and he will need to, protect our interests as a country. He'll need to protect our economic interests. It could be awkward. I think it's fair to say, Stuart, that, on environmental issues, if there was a President Harris and a Prime Minister Poilievre, Poilievre's been quite ideological on things like a price on carbon and work on climate change. However, having said that, he's a populist and not sort of as pro-business as many of his predecessors, I do think he's a politician, and I think he's an obligation to represent the people well, and he will have to do something similar to what Prime Minister Trudeau had to do when USMCA was renegotiated 6 years ago. He's going to have to rally a bunch of premiers and governors and try and make the economic case. Otherwise, we're going to get smacked around.
Gary, your take.
So I go back to thinking about Brian Mulroney and Jean Chrétien. And they were two leaders that had a vision for the country. They also both believed that to have legitimacy, you had to have representation from all across the country, not just a small segment of it. That's why guys like Don Mazinkowski were so important to Brian Mulroney, and Ralph Goodale was so important to Jean Chrétien. Today, though, unlike Richard, I'm not a partisan any longer, but I will say this. Both Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Poilievre are, in a sense, both populist. How it's expressed is different, but I think that all of them, both of them, I should say, look at not nation-building visions, but instead they look at it through the lens of how can I maximize my number of votes? And both of them are taking different approaches to it. But if you look at the public policy of the Trudeau government, a lot of it is viewed through the lens of what is this going to mean for the diaspora vote of Sikhs in Brampton or in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. That is representing some of his foreign policy. If you look at things like, as an example, the school food program, I mean, the federal government has no jurisdiction in this area, and yet they're wanting to put up $1 billion in the hopes that they will get the votes of people as a consequence of that. So Mr. Poilievre is really not doing anything that different from Mr. Trudeau. He's saying, save your expensive lobbyists. Don't clamor to me with what you want me to do for you. You go make the case that the population wants this, and I'll do it. And during the time of Chrétien and Mulroney and Martin, they all would have said it's government's role to clear the way so that good public policy can come in. Instead, you've got Mr. Poilievre saying, that's not my job. My job is to let you make that case. And if it's popular, then I'm going to jump in front of it. I don't think that that's much different than what a prime minister in power right now, in the form of Mr. Trudeau, is doing. He's going out there and trying to figure out how he maximizes votes with the programs that he spends money on.
So we talked a little bit about what that dynamic might be between a Harris presidency and a Poilievre prime ministership. I have a clip here that I want to play that CTV News had put together that I've called Canada, 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 and it's a rather interesting take from Donald Trump when he was president and he was reflecting on Canada. Let's watch that, and then Stuart, I'll come back to you for some comments.
Canada, 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 Canada. I love Canada. Canada does not treat us right in terms of the farming and the crossing the borders. Canada has been very tough on this country when it comes to timber, lumber, and other things. Very bad deal with Canada. It's called NAFTA. If we're able to make a deal with Canada and Mexico in NAFTA, then there will be no reason to do the tariffs. And we're going to hold off the tariff. Get along with Canada, but I will tell you, they have been very difficult to deal with. They're very spoiled. They're our allies, but they take advantage of us economically. And so I agree. I love Canada. At least Canada knows how I feel. Love the people of Canada. We don't like their representative very much. They've taken advantage. I love Canada, by the way. I have so many friends. I have everybody. Give my highest regards to Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. U.S., Mexico, Canada. We added Canada, worked out great. Trade agreement. And we're calling it USMCA.
He's reported to not have a high regard for our current prime minister. What happens if he regains the White House and Mr. Trudeau stays as prime minister?
Well, the last part, I think, is at this point a big if. But if we are to believe the polls or as caucus peppers, but I think those are, again, we talked about choppy waters. That sense that it is very much focused on just as you were saying, that personal relationship. That personal relationship may be unsalvageable between Trudeau and Trump, and then it goes back to that idea. Just as Richard was talking about, this idea of a Team Canada approach, that sense that it's going to have to be all hands on deck at all times to try to find every avenue of persuasion to make the case that this is in the United States' interest, but also in the administration's interest, whatever it is, the issue of the day, whether it's trade or whether it's Canada's proclivity to find itself in disagreements with other major powers around the world. We are in deep with diplomatic row with India. We just are emerging from a similar long-term disagreement with China, and so Canada needs the United States' support on the international stage. And so Mr. Trudeau will have to find a way to work with the United States, no matter how painful it is.
Maria, RBC President Dave McKay has been quite vocal about what we need to do in Canada to strengthen our relationship with the United States. He's actually not saying that we diversify. He's actually saying that we need to be looking more towards that. How important do you think it is that we start to look industry by industry, sector by sector?
So just to be clear, I'm wearing my American Chamber hat. I'm not speaking on behalf of RBC. It is very important. We can't lose sight of the fact that the U.S. is the world's largest economy. And you're right. The other speakers have noted that, Canada has become complacent and sort of lived off this neighbor next door. Every aspect of what we do is important. And really, governments can only set the framework, But at the end of the day, it comes down to the business community and our initiative to move forward, our initiative to grow. And we're always advocating for more Canadian companies to increase their business south of the border. There's a lot of opportunity that has yet to be realized. We were talking earlier about expanding outside of the U.S. internationally, and I've had discussions with BC government officials on that same topic, and they struggle to get BC companies to try and go on a trade mission to place X. It's tough. It takes a lot of effort. It really does. And so at the end of the day, we can't lose sight of the world's largest economy and what helps our economy. So
I want to play a clip from Jackie Forrest, who is co-host of a podcast out of Calgary called Arc Energy, energy experts. But what we think about so often is that, okay, we've got oil and it's one of our major exports to the United States, but either Trump or Harris, it's not necessarily, she says, not necessarily going to be good for Canada as far as the focused on oil. Can you play Jackie Forrest's clip for us? And then, Sean, I want to come to you. There's a question that really is directed towards Gary Marr.
To show that presidents have very little impact on the production of oil in the United States. In fact, there was more oil growth under President Biden than there was under Trump, and there was more under Obama than there was under Trump.
It's quite remarkable to me because we know that both President Obama and President Biden had a much stronger focus and mandate around reducing the burning of fossil fuels. Sean, can you read question number 3 there, please?
Thanks, Stu. Canada West Foundation's Gary Marr urges caution in our trade terminology when dealing with the U.S., for example, with oil. How would Canada take this approach using a friend-shoring lens when it comes to manufacturing?
It's a shift from oil, of course, but can we also play a friend-shoring role in our relationship with the United States?
I think the short answer is yes, and this is one of the pieces that I think is really important, not just for Western Canada, but for Ontario as well. One of the things that Mr. Trump has tapped into is if you look at the average income of white, uneducated, or I shouldn't say not uneducated, but non-college men in 1980 and compared it to 2020, you'll find that they used to be much higher than the American average, and now they're lower than the national average. And if you look at the average income of Hispanics and Blacks as well in the United States, you'll also find that it is below the national average. And if you look particularly at the states where it has gone down, it has been in the swing states that you're looking at in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan. And this is why so much of the campaign has been focused on the Midwest, is because the move towards globalization in the 1980s ended up hollowing out manufacturing capacity in the United States. And so guys that were, tool makers, die makers, union jobs and manufacturing in those Rust Belt states, they had a dramatic increase or decrease in their, not only their incomes, but their status in society. And so I think Mr. Trump has tapped into this. So if Canada can come up with a strategy that says, look, we can actually, help the manufacturing with things that we've got in Canada that you need, and we take into account the things that you can manufacture that we need. I think that there's a good news story here. If you look at steel as an example, somebody earlier referenced the tariffs on steel and aluminum. When Mr. Trump put those tariffs in, I think the American Steel Association went to him and said, hey, actually, we export more steel than we import from Canada. So if they put on a countervailing duty, we're actually worse off, not better off, as a result of your tariffs. And if we can find those kinds of arguments to make, province to state, and state to province, and figure out where we can take advantage of clean energy technologies that are being developed in Western Canada and across Canada. If we can focus on, the auto sector and deal with that, this would be good for both sides of the border. And one of the areas that I think that we should really be looking at is defense manufacturing. Generally speaking, I'm not really a fan of industrial policy, but this is an area where maybe industrial policy makes sense. It seems to be the reality of the world. The Inflation Reduction Act is probably the most cleverly named piece of legislation that's got nothing to do with inflation reduction, but it has put a ton of money into the development of certain areas of technology and clean technology. But if we were to be a good neighbor, trade is sometimes not about trade. Trade is sometimes about things not related to trade. And when people talk about, upping our defense spending to 2% of GDP, I think, if you listen to Premier Canoe of Manitoba, he was down in Washington, D.C. in a trip with Gary Dewar earlier this year, and that's exactly what he talked about. So, look at F-35 fighter jet.
Oops.
Demand. We've got a huge air base at Cold Lake, Alberta. It'd be a fantastic place to be training F-35 pilots from all over the world in a place that is far, far away from prying, spying eyes. So the short answer is yes. I think there's things that we should and could be doing.
So I have one more clip that I want to play, and this is from former New Jersey Governor Chrustie when he was up in Toronto at the Regent debates, and I would like to play it as a setup to come back to each of you for closing remarks because we're running a little bit over time here, but this is such a fascinating conversation. Can you play that?
First, we need to separate, as Conrad mentioned earlier, rhetoric from reality. I know you might find this hard to believe, but sometimes rhetoric in American politics does not match policy or reality. And I would say that Donald Trump is one of the number one purveyors of a difference between what he says on the campaign trail and what happens in the governing process. One need only look at the statistics that Conrad mentioned and what has happened in the intervening 4 years to the American economy, and as a result, the economies of many of the other Western nations regarding inflation, regarding prosperity, to see that there is a marked difference, not based upon how crazy everyone may think Trump is. How about I concede, for the sake of this debate, that he is erratic? I'll concede it. But it doesn't define his policies any more in a second term than it did in the first. Nothing America and a Trump presidency would love more than a Canada that had lower taxes, less regulation, and a robust, growing private sector economy. That would be good for the United States as well. A growing U.S. economy, which a Trump set of policies will provide, presents enormous opportunity for Canada. As far as trade and tariffs go, all anyone has to do to understand Donald Trump's approach on this is to read The Art of the Deal, a long ago book by Donald Trump, where he talks extensively about how you have to rhetorically go all the way in one direction so that you can land someplace in the middle. If you look at his tariff policies in the first term, they're nowhere near as severe as he said they would be, and no, they will not be again. Because in the end, what Trump understands is Canada's not our adversary. China is our adversary.
You put a lot on the table there. Not entirely sure that he is opposed to Donald Trump, even though he ran against him in the primaries. But it puts out there a number of thoughts, and I thought it would just fuel your imaginations for some closing remarks. I'm going to sort of work my way down from west to east here. Calvin, I want to start with you. As you sort of think about this evening, our discussion, what stands out for you the most that we really should be paying attention to in the next week or two as the U.S. election comes to a conclusion?
I think Canadians need to reflect in the last couple of years and even the last couple of months in terms of our diplomatic strategy globally. That I'm not sure if would get an A from our teachers in recent years. And I think particularly as it comes to the U.S., I think it's going to be, rocky waters, 100%. I think particularly the tolerance in the economic sector and economic security, I think has to shift if we're going to survive it all. And so what I'm saying is it's not necessarily the defense sector or the political sector, but I think it's the economic sector. I think it's business leaders in Canada need to be really looking at what are they going to do to build that relationship with our partners, the U.S., NATO, Five Eyes. And if we don't focus on that, and if they don't take responsibility for that, I'm very concerned about the next generation in terms of what's going to happen. And I think if we look at the example of the TD Bank in the last 6 months, I think we should really pay attention in terms of what that was, because my own assessment of it working in the money laundering world was that was a message to Canada in terms of kill the chicken in front of the monkeys. And there's more to come post this election if we're not kind of changing things. And that means in the corporate sector, not just in the defense sector.
From an economic perspective, Maria, is Chrustie right? The United States would be so happy to see a vibrant Canadian economy and that it is a benefit to both.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I know that clip focused predominantly on Trump. However,
well, it's so entertaining.
It is. However, we have to keep in mind that really both Republicans and Democrats have a protectionist viewpoint. So, there is a lot of common ground when it comes to somewhat of an America First policy. Having said that, Canada and the U.S. have had such a long-standing relationship, regardless of the rhetoric that is said on the campaign trail. Yes, it sells a lot of, views and maybe gets a lot of votes. But at the end of the day, what's going to matter to folks is the jobs, what's in their pockets, the economy. And that's something that our two countries have been doing so well for such a long time. And we have so much more to do together. So I'm very optimistic, regardless of the push and the pull on the phrase of our relationship. Our core relationship is what's strong and will continue to carry us through. Thank you.
Mario, over to you.
We have grown with this idea of the Trump voter being that guy draped in the flag with the horns walking towards Capitol Hill. There's a big difference between 2016 and now. 2016 was mostly Republican voters traditionally over 55 who were dissatisfied with the way things were going, who connected very well with that message. What is different about this election is that it's the 18 to 34-year-old that is looking at the Republicans seriously and thinking maybe we'd be better off if we let Trump back into the White House. That has been a revelation. You look at your data and you go, how can this be possible? And there's so many issues that haven't been dealt with. And Joe Biden, to his credit, tried to salvage this by talking about billions of this and millions of that. It didn't resonate with that crowd. Now, the big difference as well, if you compare 2016 to 2024, is the level of intensity from women when it comes to Vice President Harris, significantly higher than what we saw with Hillary Clinton back in 2016, aided partly by a certain Supreme Court decision that we had a few months ago. But it's different. It's not your bloc. It's not the same type of voter that is supporting Trump right now than it was in 2016. And just a couple of things. We're all going to be watching election night, obviously, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Two states that are interesting because the gubernatorial candidates from the Republicans are particularly unpopular are North Carolina and Arizona. So watch out for those two.
Stewart, Mario brings up an interesting point about who is it that is now trailing in behind Trump. What's happening? And I know that you may have been preparing closing remarks, but if you can include that in your answer.
Yeah, I think it's directly relevant because what we're seeing in the United States and that demographic voting shift, we are seeing in Canada as well. We're seeing in Europe in election after election, the sense that younger voters, particularly young men, but younger voters across the board are more and more feeling left out, left behind. Whether we're looking at access to the job market, it's always hardest for those trying to come in at the bottom level. Younger workers are having more trouble finding jobs, but of course the housing market is such a huge challenge. Finding ways to build towards a more prosperous future where ambition still seems like it is a relevant thing to hold on to, that is missing for younger voters in Canada and the United States and in much of the democratic world. And so whatever shearing forces we see in the United States, we have to be prepared to deal with them here as well. So trying to find ways to not just say we still see you, we include you, but to actually make meaningful changes so that reality actually sinks in. Otherwise, we are going to see more of this kind of centripetal force in our democracies in the United States, also in Canada, as people throw up their hands and say, I'm not voting for a centrist, institutional, normal party. I'm going to look for something different. I'm just going to shake the snow globe and see what happens. And so that's always a scary prospect when more and more people around the world are taking that attitude.
That is a scary prospect. Shake the snow globe and see what happens. Yeah. And Gary.
Well, look, I want to tell a story about both Gary Doer as a premier and Ralph Klein as a premier, and then Gary Doer as an ambassador later. Both of them spent a lot of time in the United States. They would go to organizations like the Council of State Governments, where they met people that were state assemblymen or state senators. They would spend time with the Western Governors Association, where they'd spend time with governors. And, I think this was important. And when Doer became ambassador, he recognized when he was premier, and I think Ralph Klein did as well, that today's state assemblyman might be tomorrow's congressman. Today's congressman might be tomorrow's governor. Today's governor might become a U.S. senator, or might become a member of the cabinet of the president of the United States. And so when Gary Doer arrived as our ambassador in Washington, he was ready on day one. And so that's something that I would encourage, is that it's not just about the relationship between Ottawa and Washington, D.C. It's also the relationship, between provinces and the states that they do the most amount of business with. I know that in Ontario, they've been involved with the Council of State Governments for some number of years. And if you look at Atlantic Canada, the Atlantic premiers have been involved with the New England governors. Here in Western Canada, we have groups like the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, where representatives from the United States and Canadian provinces and territories meet to talk about common issues. And so I think this is an important relationship to recognize, because you never know when, the guy that is the congressman from the state of Nebraska suddenly finds himself thrust into the position of being the Secretary of Agriculture. And when you got something like BSC and the ban on Canadian beef that existed in 2005, Ralph Klein was able to call up the Secretary of Agriculture, get a meeting, and we were able to resolve it. So it's not just about the relationship. This should be an all-out relationship affair between provinces, their leaders, and state governments.
And Richard, your closing thoughts.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, that's the first point. Picking up what Gary just said there, I think, and Maria said this too, the relationship is so deep, so rich, so complex that it does go beyond who's president, who's prime minister. We do need to engage, as Gary was just suggesting, governors and assembly members and state representatives, and in the moment to put pressure on administrations, because that and talk about the economics, but also, as Gary suggested, for the future. So it is a complex thing. It is such a large thing. It will involve premiers and governors and legislators on both sides, and it has to. Second thing I would say is, as everyone has already observed, yes, we're in for choppy waters. And when we say, at least when I say, that we're in for choppy waters no matter who wins, I guess I want to say two things about that. One, my own personal opinion is I believe Trump is a threat to democratic institutions. He's I fear the election of Trump for a bunch of reasons. But if Kamala Harris wins next week, it doesn't mean that we have clear sailing. We still have a big challenge in front of us, and the days of open trade agreements, the WTO, and so forth, unfortunately, seem to be waning, and the rise of mercantilism and tariffs and so forth seems to be on the rise. And I think that's a huge threat to Canada because we are a trading nation of 40 million people who relies on world markets. The good news for us is that the U.S. also relies on world markets and relies on our market. So there is a case to be made. And then the last thing is the point where we started off, Stuart, which is, and the thing I learned when I talked to all the trade experts in Washington and Ottawa, they call Trump tariff man, because trade negotiators generally believe in open markets and free trade, and he is the antithesis of that. But the real story here is China and China's access to the market through NAFTA. We have 100% tariff on electric vehicles in both countries right now. Canada would be wise to get ahead of the negotiations and the review on the USMCA and be as strong as the United States is going to be on trying to make sure that China is not able to use our trading relationships with the U.S. and Mexico as a way to dump goods made with cheap labor and no environmental protection on our market. And we know that's coming. We might as well get ahead of it and be in the lead of it, because it's in our interest to do so, and it's in our interest to make sure we get on a similar page to our American counterparts on that.
Well, it's a valuable conversation that we're having here tonight. All of us have to keep having these kinds of conversations so that we remain diligent and stay on top of the changing trends that are coming towards us. We have to be, of course, very careful that we're not narrowly focused only on one market. We are a trading nation, as you pointed out, Richard, and with a global reach, but we have not reached out to the best of our ability. This election and the wave of protectionism in the United States is a good wake-up call for us, and hopefully more of us will pay attention. Thank you all for your participation. For those of you who are in Vancouver right now, you get a coveted Conversations Live mug, and Gary and Richard will be sending you a coveted Conversations Live mug so that you can add it to your collection of coffee mugs. Thank you to all of you who joined us in person and then online. And I just want to give one last reminder. Please check out Raise a Reader on the Vancouver Sun. And if you can, support them in some way, because this is the kind of resource that we want to be able to pass along to next generations so that they can have thoughtful, in-depth conversations and think their way through the challenges of the future. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you for tuning into Conversations Live, an Oh Boy Productions program. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find our previous and upcoming episodes at conversationslive.ca. You can also follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Again, thank you. I'm Stuart McNish.